The year was 2347, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Council for 70 years now. Ambassador Victoria Brennan sat in her office on the council station, reviewing the latest reports from the border regions with growing concern. She had spent 20 years of her life in diplomatic service, negotiating treaties and maintaining peace between Earth and the 17 alien species that made up the council. It was exhausting work, made harder by the fact that most council members still viewed humanity as newcomers who needed to be kept in check. Victoria looked at the data scrolling across her screen and felt her stomach tighten. The Vakrian Empire had violated human territory 47 times in the last 3 months. Each time, Earth had filed formal complaints through proper channels. Each time, the Council had dismissed the incidents as navigation errors or misunderstandings. Victoria knew better. The Vakrians were testing them, pushing boundaries to see how far they could go before humanity pushed back. Out at the edge of human space, Admiral Kyle Henderson stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance and stared at the same reports Victoria was reading. His flagship was a massive carrier-class vessel, home to 3,000 crew members and command center for the entire Terran Defense Fleet. 43 warships answered to him, spread across 6 star systems, all tasked with protecting human colonies and trade routes. It should have been enough firepower to make any aggressor think twice, but Henderson knew the truth. His fleet was handicapped by regulations that made them nearly useless in any real conflict. Captain Lisa Morgan entered the bridge and walked to his side. She was his second in command, a tactical genius who had served with Henderson for 12 years. She handed him a tablet without saying a word. Henderson read the message, and his jaw clenched. Another Vakrian incursion. This time only 2 light-years from New Seattle. The patrol ship that detected them had been forced to retreat per council regulations. No weapons fired, no warning shots, nothing that might escalate tensions. Henderson wanted to throw the tablet across the bridge, but he controlled himself. Lisa knew what he was thinking because she was thinking the same thing. The rules of engagement imposed by the Galactic Council were strangling them. Human vessels could only fire in direct self-defense. They had to retreat when confronted by Council enforcers. They could not deploy their full arsenal without Council approval, which could take weeks or months to obtain. Meanwhile, species like the Vakrians did whatever they wanted because they knew humanity's hands were tied. Commander Greg Palmer commanded one of those patrol vessels, the UNS Vigilant. He was a career officer who had spent 15 years in deep space, and he was tired of running from fights. His sensor officer had detected the Vakrian ships 3 hours ago, tracking them as they surveyed human territory like they owned it. Palmer had wanted to intercept, to at least demand they state their business in human space. But regulations said he had to observe and report. So that's what he did, watching the Vakrians complete their reconnaissance before jumping away to wherever they came from. Palmer filed his report and then sat in his quarters, staring at the wall. His crew was frustrated. They had trained for combat, prepared for war, and instead, they spent their days watching potential enemies map human defenses while they did nothing. It was humiliating. Every member of his crew knew they could take those Vakrian scouts in a fight, but they would never get the chance to prove it. On New Seattle, Governor Amy Rodriguez was dealing with the same frustration on a civilian level. Her colony was home to 30,000 people who had come to this world looking for a fresh start. They had built homes, started farms, established businesses. New Seattle was a success story, proof that humanity could thrive beyond Earth. But lately, Amy had noticed an increase in unidentified ships in their system. Her chief of security, Officer Danny Wright, had documented 17 separate incidents of what appeared to be surveillance. Danny had a military background, and he recognized reconnaissance when he saw it. The ships were always Vakrian, always just beyond weapons range, and always gone before any human patrol could respond. He told Amy they needed better defenses, maybe even a permanent military presence in orbit. Amy agreed, but when she sent the request to Earth, the response was disappointing. The Galactic Council had to approve any military buildup in colony systems, and the Council was unlikely to grant permission without concrete evidence of a threat. Amy had sent that evidence to Ambassador Victoria Brennan 3 times now. Each time, Victoria had presented it to the Council. Each time, she was told that the Vakrians had legitimate navigation rights through human space, and that their presence near New Seattle was not inherently hostile. Amy wanted to scream. How many times did ships have to circle your home before it became hostile intent? But she kept her composure and continued to document every incident, building a case that even the Council couldn't ignore. Then everything changed. A human cargo vessel, the Meridian Star, was traveling from New Seattle to the Mars shipyards when it encountered a Vakrian battle group. The Meridian Star was unarmed, clearly marked as civilian transport, and carrying agricultural supplies. None of that mattered to the Vakrians. They opened fire without warning and destroyed the ship in seconds. 47 crew members died, their escape pods targeted and eliminated before they could even transmit a distress call. Only the ship's black box survived, ejected automatically and recovered 2 days later by a human patrol. Admiral Henderson watched the black box recording in silence. The bridge crew of the UN's Defiance stood behind him, equally quiet. They saw the Vakrian ships appear on sensors, saw the Meridian Star's captain attempt to hail them, saw the weapons fire that tore through the civilian vessel like it was made of paper. Then they watched as Vakrian fighters systematically destroyed every escape pod, ensuring there would be no survivors to tell the story. It was murder, plain and simple, and it was captured in perfect detail. Henderson demanded permission to respond immediately. He wanted to take the fleet into Vakrian space and exact justice for those 47 lives. Captain Lisa Morgan was already preparing tactical plans when the order came down from Earth. The Galactic Council would investigate the incident and deliver a judgment within 90 days. Until then, all human military forces were to maintain current positions and avoid any action that might prejudice the investigation. Henderson read the order twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. 90 days. 3 months, while bureaucrats debated, and the Vakrians prepared their excuses. Victoria Brennan fought for humanity in the council chambers, but she was one voice against 16 others. The Vakrians claimed the Meridian Star had been transmitting false identification and appeared to be a military vessel conducting espionage. It was an obvious lie, but several council members seemed willing to consider it. The investigation would take time to examine all evidence and interview witnesses. Justice would be served through proper channels. Victoria wanted to overturn the table and walk out, but she stayed, arguing until her voice was hoarse, achieving nothing. Back on New Seattle, Amy Rodriguez gathered her senior staff and showed them the news about the Meridian Star. Danny Wright asked if they should expect retaliation from Earth. Amy shook her head. Earth couldn't retaliate without council approval, and the council would never approve. They were on their own out here, protected by regulations that meant nothing to species willing to ignore them. She ordered Danny to quietly upgrade their defenses as much as possible within legal limits. It wasn't much, but it was something. The fragile peace was cracking, and everyone could feel it. 3 weeks had passed since the Meridian Star was destroyed, and the investigation was still ongoing. The Galactic Council had interviewed exactly 4 witnesses and reviewed half of the available evidence. Ambassador Victoria Brennan sat in another pointless session, listening to Vakrian representatives explain why they needed more time to prepare their defense. She felt sick to her stomach but maintained her diplomatic composure. That same morning, everything she had feared came true. Governor Amy Rodriguez was in her office on New Seattle when the alarms started screaming. Her screen lit up with alerts from the orbital detection grid. 18 Vakrian warships had just entered the system, and they were not slowing down. Amy's hands moved automatically, activating the colony's defense protocols, even as her mind struggled to process what was happening. This wasn't a border incursion or a reconnaissance flight. This was an invasion fleet. Officer Danny Wright reached the command center within 2 minutes of the alarm. He took one look at the tactical display, and his blood went cold. The Vakrian ships were in attack formation, moving directly toward New Seattle with weapons charged. Danny grabbed the communications console and started broadcasting on all frequencies. Mayday, Mayday, Vakrian fleet attacking New Seattle, requesting immediate military assistance. He knew help wouldn't arrive in time, but he sent the message anyway, hoping someone would at least know what happened here. Amy activated the colony's defense grid, a system of orbital weapon platforms and ground-based missile batteries. They had been upgraded as much as regulations allowed, but it wasn't enough. The Vakrians opened fire, and 3 orbital platforms vanished in fireballs before they could return a single shot. Amy watched her defenses crumble and made the hardest decision of her life. She ordered a colony-wide evacuation to the underground shelters. The sirens changed pitch, and 30,000 people dropped everything they were doing. Parents grabbed children, teachers herded students into basements, hospital staff moved patients to lower levels. The evacuation drills they had practiced for years suddenly became terribly real. People ran through the streets toward shelter entrances, some crying, some silent with shock, all of them terrified. Above them, Vakrian ships entered orbit and began their bombardment. Danny Wright had activated his emergency militia protocols. New Seattle had 500 trained volunteers who could serve as defenders in a crisis. Militia Commander Jacob Hayes assembled them at the armory, distributing weapons and armor as fast as possible. Jacob was a former Marine who had retired to New Seattle 3 years ago. He looked at his volunteers, farmers and shopkeepers, and teachers who had never expected to fight for their lives, and told them to spread out across the city. Get people to shelters, protect the evacuation sites, and make the Vakrians pay for every inch of ground. The first impacts hit the northern residential district. Amy watched the tactical display from her command center and felt her heart break. The Vakrians weren't targeting military installations or infrastructure. They were hitting civilian areas, places where the most people lived. Schools, hospitals, apartment complexes, all of them burning under plasma bombardment. Lieutenant Ben Carter, the sensor officer on Commander Greg Palmer's patrol ship, would later count 43 impact sites in the first 10 minutes. This wasn't a military operation. This was genocide. Commander Palmer's UNS Vigilant arrived in the system just in time to witness the horror. His ship had been 3 light-years away when they picked up Danny Wright's distress call. Palmer had violated his orders and jumped immediately toward New Seattle, knowing he would likely be too late but unable to sit idle while people died. Now he saw the Vakrian fleet in orbit, saw the plasma fire raining down on the colony, and he ordered his weapons officer to prepare for engagement. Palmer's crew responded instantly, but they never got the chance to fire. 6 Vakrian fighters broke formation and came straight for the Vigilant. They hit the patrol ship with everything they had, targeting engines and weapons systems with precision that spoke of planning and practice. Palmer's vessel went dead in space. Life support functioning, but all combat capabilities destroyed. He was forced to watch helplessly as the colony burned below, and his crew could do nothing but bear witness. In the capital city, Amy Rodriguez stayed at her post in the command center. The building shook with nearby impacts, and her staff begged her to evacuate to the shelters. Amy refused. She was transmitting everything to Earth and the Council, every sensor reading, every communication, every second of video footage. The galaxy would see this crime, and no amount of Vakrian lies could explain it away. Her communications officer managed to establish a link with the UNS Defiance, sending the data stream directly to Admiral Henderson's flagship. Danny Wright found Amy in the command center 20 minutes into the bombardment. Half the building was on fire, and the structural integrity was failing. He physically grabbed her and tried to pull her toward the exit. Amy fought him, screaming that she had to keep transmitting, that evidence was the only weapon they had left. Danny told her the transmission was automated now, that her death wouldn't help anyone. They were still arguing when the Vakrian missile hit the government complex. The building vanished in a fireball that could be seen from orbit. Commander Palmer watched it happen from the crippled Vigilant. Lieutenant Ben Carter was crying at his station, but he kept recording, documenting everything just like Amy had wanted. Palmer sent a tight beam message to the nearest human outpost, marked Priority Alpha. New Seattle is being massacred. Governor Rodriguez is dead. The Vakrians are using banned weapons on civilian targets. For the love of God, send help. Jacob Hayes was in the Western Shelter District when he saw the government complex explode. He knew Amy had been inside, and he knew she was gone. Around him, militia volunteers were helping the last civilians into the underground bunkers. Jacob sealed the entrance behind them and turned to face his remaining fighters. 20 men and women stood with him, all of them armed, and none of them willing to hide while their home burned. They moved through the city like ghosts, documenting the destruction and sending video feeds to any human ship in range. The Vakrian bombardment continued for 14 hours. Every military target was destroyed in the first 30 minutes. After that, it was pure slaughter. They hit refugee shelters, medical clinics, the central water treatment plant. They used plasma weapons that turned buildings into molten slag and caused fires that spread through entire districts. When something moved in the streets, they targeted it with fighter patrols. The Vakrians wanted New Seattle erased, and they were methodical about it. Then they landed ground forces. Dropships descended through the smoke and ash, disgorging Vakrian soldiers into what remained of the capital city. They moved through the ruins systematically, searching for survivors. When they found sealed shelter entrances, they used breaching charges to force them open. Jacob Hayes and his militia arrived at one shelter just as Vakrians pulled civilians out onto the street. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Vakrians executed them. Every person they pulled from that shelter was killed immediately. No questions asked, no mercy given. Men, women, children, elderly. It made no difference. They were shot and left in the street while the Vakrians moved to the next shelter. Jacob wanted to attack, but 20 militia couldn't stop a Vakrian company. Instead, he recorded everything and transmitted it with a single message. They are killing survivors. They want us extinct. The massacre continued through the night. Jacob moved his people from shelter to shelter, trying to warn civilians and evacuate them before the Vakrians arrived. They saved perhaps 200 people, getting them out of the city and into the wilderness, where there was at least a chance of survival. Behind them, New Seattle died. By morning, the fires were beginning to burn themselves out. The Vakrian commander surveyed the destruction from his flagship and seemed satisfied. He ordered his forces back to their ships. The Vakrian fleet left the system 36 hours after they had arrived. They had accomplished their objective completely. New Seattle was destroyed, its population reduced from 30,000 to less than 8,000 survivors. Governor Amy Rodriguez was dead, along with most of her administration. Officer Danny Wright was dead. Hundreds of militia volunteers were dead. 22,000 civilians were dead, their bodies buried in rubble or burned beyond recognition. Commander Palmer's crew finally managed to restart the Vigilance engines 3 hours after the Vakrians departed. He took his damaged ship into orbit around New Seattle and sent shuttles down to the surface. What they found was beyond description. Lieutenant Ben Carter threw up when he saw the shelter where the executions had taken place. The rescue teams found Jacob Hayes and his survivors in the forest outside the city. Jacob looked at the human soldiers and asked a simple question. Is anyone coming to make this right? Palmer didn't know how to answer. He promised to get the survivors to safety, and he promised that Earth would know what happened here. Whether anyone would do anything about it was beyond his control. But as his crew loaded refugees onto shuttles and documented the crime scene that New Seattle had become, Palmer made a personal vow. If the Vakrians thought humanity would accept this, they were about to learn how wrong they were. He just hoped someone with more authority than him felt the same way. Admiral Kyle Henderson was in a conference with Earth Command when the transmission from New Seattle arrived. He had been arguing for permission to move his fleet closer to the colony when his communications officer interrupted with an urgent priority message. Henderson told Earth Command to hold and switched to the incoming feed. What he saw in the next 5 minutes changed everything. The video showed Governor Amy Rodriguez at her post, coordinating evacuations while Vacrian plasma fire destroyed her city around her. Henderson watched her transmit evidence to the galaxy even as her staff begged her to flee. He saw the determination in her eyes, the absolute conviction that documenting this crime mattered more than her own survival. Then the feed went white as the missile hit, and Amy Rodriguez ceased to exist. Henderson's hands gripped the edge of his desk, so hard, the material cracked. More footage followed. Shelter executions recorded by Jacob Hayes and his militia. Children pulled from hiding places and shot in the street. Hospitals burning, with patients still inside. Vacrian soldiers laughing as they set fire to a school. The transmission lasted 40 minutes, and every second of it was burned into Henderson's memory. When it finally ended, the Admiral sat in silence for a full minute before he spoke to Earth Command. He told them he was taking the fleet to New Seattle immediately, and if they tried to stop him, they would have to court-martial him after the fact because he was going either way. Earth Command told him to wait. Ambassador Victoria Brennan had already contacted them from the Council station with orders. The Galactic Council was convening an emergency session to address the New Seattle incident, and all human military forces were required to hold position while the Council evaluated the situation. No provocative actions could be taken until the proper authorities had made their assessment. Henderson stared at the screen in disbelief. 22,000 people were dead, and the Council wanted to evaluate the situation. Henderson terminated the connection without acknowledging the order. He turned to Captain Lisa Morgan, who had been standing beside him through the entire transmission. She met his eyes, and he saw the same cold fury reflected there that he felt. Henderson told her to assemble senior staff in the war room immediately, and to make sure the room was secure. What they were about to discuss would be considered treason by some people, and he wanted no interruptions. 30 minutes later, every senior officer of the Terran Defense Fleet was gathered in the war room of the UNS Defiance. Henderson played the New Seattle transmission, from beginning to end. He let them see Amy Rodriguez die. He let them watch the executions, and the burning shelters, and the systematic extermination of a human colony. When it was over, several officers were crying. Most were silent. All of them were angry beyond words. Henderson asked a simple question. How long were they going to let regulations written by aliens dictate how humanity defended itself? How many more colonies had to burn before they admitted the Council system wasn't working? The Vacrians had committed genocide against human civilians, and the Council's response was to schedule meetings and evaluate evidence. Henderson was done evaluating. He wanted vengeance, and he wanted it now. The question was whether his officers would follow him into what would certainly be considered an illegal war. Captain Lisa Morgan was the first to respond. She laid out tactical data showing that the Vacrian Empire controlled 12 star systems with 16 major military installations. Their home fleet consisted of approximately 200 warships, mostly cruiser and destroyer class with a handful of larger capital ships. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, the Vacrians had never fought an opponent willing to hit back. Every conflict in their history had been against weaker species who couldn't match their firepower. They had grown arrogant and complacent. Fleet Engineer Commander Paul Stevens provided the information that changed everything. He explained that every human warship was operating under artificial restrictions imposed by Council regulations. Their weapons systems had governors that limited output to levels the Council deemed acceptable. Their engines were throttled to prevent speed advantages. Even their shields were set to reduced capacity to avoid appearing too militarily capable. The Council had required these limitations as a condition of humanity joining their organization, and Earth had agreed, viewing it as a necessary compromise for galactic citizenship. But Stevens revealed something else. Earth's military leadership had never fully trusted the Council. While publicly complying with all regulations, they had been secretly testing and developing weapons systems far beyond what the Council knew existed. Every human warship carried equipment that had never been activated. Hidden shipyards and remote systems had been constructing vessels designed for total warfare. Research facilities scattered across human space had created weapons that violated multiple galactic treaties. Humanity had been preparing for exactly this moment, the day when playing by the rules was no longer an option. Henderson asked Stevens how long it would take to remove all the restrictions from the fleet. Stevens said he could do it in 6 hours if he had authorization. Henderson provided that authorization immediately. He activated Protocol Reckoning, a classified directive that had been sitting in secure databases for 40 years. The protocol was simple. In the event that the Galactic Council failed to protect human civilians from existential threats, the Terran Defense Fleet was authorized to act independently, using any and all available resources to defend humanity, regardless of Council regulations or galactic law. Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Nina Ross added crucial information about what Protocol Reckoning actually meant in practical terms. Earth had been building a secret second fleet for decades, 60 warships that the Council had no knowledge of, constructed in hidden shipyards, and manned by crews trained specifically for unrestricted combat. These vessels carried the newest weapons, the fastest engines, and the most advanced AI systems humanity could produce. They had been waiting in deep space for the day they would be needed. That day had arrived. Henderson made the decision that would define his place in history. He told his officers they were going to war with the Vakrian Empire, and they were going to prosecute that war with every weapon at their disposal. No more rules of engagement. No more waiting for Council approval. No more holding back. The Vakrians had shown humanity what they thought of human life, and Henderson intended to respond in kind. He looked around the room and asked if anyone objected. Not a single officer spoke against him. The Admiral then addressed every ship in the fleet simultaneously. He appeared on screens across 43 vessels, his face hard, and his voice steady. He told them about New Seattle, and he showed them the footage of Amy Rodriguez and Danny Wright and the 22,000 dead. He told them about the Council's response, the delays and the investigations and the political maneuvering that meant nothing would be done. He told them that he had activated Protocol Reckoning and removed all restrictions from their ships. Henderson explained what that meant in clear terms. The weapons they had never been allowed to use were now fully operational. The engines that had been throttled were now running at full capacity. The shields they had kept at minimum power were now at maximum strength. Every advantage humanity possessed, every technological edge they had been forced to hide, was now theirs to employ. The Terran Defense Fleet was about to show the galaxy what humans became when someone slaughtered their children. The response from the fleet was immediate and unanimous. Across every ship, crews cheered and prepared for war. Commander Paul Stevens worked with engineering teams throughout the fleet, remotely removing safety limiters and activating dormant systems. Weapons that had been sitting cold for years came online with full power. Reactors that had been artificially restricted surged to outputs that made the ships hum with barely contained energy. Shield generators reached capacities that would have shocked Council observers. Henderson gave them 6 hours to prepare, and then set course for Vakrian space. He sent a single message to Earth Command and Ambassador Victoria Brennan. The Terran Defense Fleet no longer recognizes Galactic Council authority over human military operations. We are moving to engage the Vakrian Empire in response to their genocide against New Seattle. This action is taken under Protocol Reckoning and is not subject to negotiation or recall. Inform the Council that humanity is done holding back. Victoria Brennan received the message while sitting in an emergency council session. The Vakrian representatives were explaining that the New Seattle incident had been a tragic misunderstanding, and they were conducting their own investigation. Victoria listened to Henderson's message through her private comm and felt a wave of conflicting emotions. As a diplomat, she knew this would destroy everything she had built. As a human being who had watched Amy Rodriguez die, she wanted to stand up and cheer. She settled for forwarding the message to the Council without comment, and then sitting back to watch the chaos unfold. The Council chamber erupted in outrage. Multiple species demanded that Earth recall its fleet immediately. Threats of sanctions and military intervention filled the air. Victoria waited until they were done shouting, and then she stood. She played the full New Seattle transmission for the Council, forcing them to watch every minute of it. When it ended, she asked them a simple question. What exactly did they expect humanity to do? The Council had no answer that satisfied anyone, least of all Victoria Brennan. Meanwhile, the Terran Defense Fleet crossed into Vakrian space and every ship was ready for war. The Terran Defense Fleet arrived at the Vakrian border world of Krill 72 hours after leaving human space. The planet was a military stronghold, home to 50,000 Vakrian troops and a significant fleet presence. Intelligence indicated 30 warships in orbit, along with extensive ground-based defense systems. It was exactly the kind of target Admiral Kyle Henderson wanted for his opening move. He needed to send a message that would be heard across the entire galaxy, and Krill would provide that opportunity. The Vakrians detected the human fleet while it was still 3 light minutes out. Their response was predictable and arrogant. 25 warships moved to intercept, leaving 5 behind to protect the orbital installations. The Vakrian commander sent a transmission demanding the humans withdraw immediately or face destruction. He referenced Council regulations and threatened to report this violation to the proper authorities. Henderson didn't bother responding. He simply gave Captain Lisa Morgan the order she had been waiting for: engage at will. The UNS Defiance opened fire at a range the Vakrians didn't think was possible. Quantum torpedoes crossed the distance in seconds, each one phasing through Vakrian shields as if they weren't even there. The lead Vakrian cruiser exploded before its crew understood they were under attack. 2 more ships followed in the next 5 seconds. The Vakrian formation broke apart in confusion, trying to comprehend weapons that ignored their defenses completely. Captain Morgan coordinated the assault with cold precision. She had spent 20 years studying warfare, and now she finally had permission to apply everything she knew. The Defiance's railguns fired next, launching projectiles at relativistic speeds. The kinetic energy alone was enough to tear through Vakrian armor like it was made of foil. Directed energy weapons followed, coherent beams of concentrated power that cut enemy vessels in half. The Vakrians tried to return fire, but their shots were absorbed by human shields operating at capacity levels they had never seen before. Commander Paul Stevens pushed the Defiance's engines beyond what Council regulations would have allowed. The massive carrier moved with an agility that shouldn't have been possible for a ship that size, dodging incoming fire and positioning for optimal firing solutions. The Vakrians had based their tactical assessments on previous encounters with human vessels, slow and restricted, and easy to outmaneuver. This new reality was destroying everything they thought they knew about human military capability. Commander Greg Palmer led a squadron of destroyers against the orbital defense platforms. His ship, the Vigilant, had been fully repaired and upgraded with the weapon systems he had always known existed, but never been allowed to use. Palmer remembered watching helplessly as New Seattle burned, and now he channeled that rage into pure tactical efficiency. His squadron moved like a pack of predators, each ship covering the others while they systematically dismantled Vakrian defenses. Lieutenant Ben Carter was Palmer's tactical officer, and he had spent weeks analyzing the New Seattle attack. He knew exactly how the Vakrians operated, their patterns and preferences. Carter fed that information into targeting computers that were no longer restricted by artificial limitations. Every shot his crew fired hit its target. Every torpedo found its mark. The Vakrian defense platforms, designed to repel conventional attacks, had no answer for weapons that were 3 generations ahead of anything they had encountered. The space battle lasted 18 minutes from first shot to final casualty. 25 Vakrian warships were destroyed or crippled beyond repair. Not a single human vessel took serious damage. The 5 Vakrian ships that had remained in orbit around Krill attempted to flee. Henderson ordered them disabled, not destroyed. He wanted survivors who could report what they had witnessed. He wanted the Vakrian High Command to understand that this was not a skirmish or a raid. This was the beginning of a systematic dismantling of their entire military structure. With orbital space secured, Henderson turned his attention to the surface. He deployed humanity's ground forces, led by Colonel Sam Turner. These were not peacekeepers or occupation troops. They were soldiers trained specifically for high-intensity combat against opponents who might not share human concepts of warfare ethics. They wore powered armor that made them faster and stronger than any Vakrian. They carried plasma weapons that made Vakrian's small arms look like toys. They were supported by tactical AI that coordinated their movements with inhuman precision. The Vakrian garrison on Krill was one of their finest. They had fortifications, air support, and numerical superiority. None of it mattered. Colonel Turner's forces hit the main military complex with overwhelming force. Powered armor allowed human soldiers to move faster than Vakrian eyes could track. Their weapons cut through Vakrian fortifications like they were cardboard. AI coordination meant that every human soldier knew where every other soldier was at all times, eliminating friendly fire and maximizing tactical efficiency. The Vakrian defenders tried to mount an organized resistance, but they were facing an enemy that operated on a completely different level. Human soldiers moved like they were sharing a single mind, flanking and supporting and overwhelming defensive positions with textbook precision. When Vakrians set up heavy weapons, Crete, human artillery eliminated them from orbit with pinpoint accuracy. When Vakrian aircraft tried to provide support, human fighters shot them down before they could engage. The battle was less a fight and more an execution. 6 hours after the landing began, the Vakrian commander on Krill sent a surrender message. Colonel Turner accepted on the condition that all Vakrian forces lay down their arms immediately and gather in designated areas. The Vakrians complied, too shocked and demoralized to continue fighting. Turner posted guards, but there were no incidents. The garrison had seen what human soldiers could do, and they had no desire to give them an excuse to demonstrate it again. Admiral Henderson did not occupy Krill. That was never his intention. Instead, he set up broadcast equipment across the planet and recorded a message that would be transmitted on every Vakrian frequency and every galactic channel. He stood in the ruins of the Vakrian military headquarters and spoke directly to anyone listening. This is what happens when you attack human civilians. This is what we become when you cross the line. You have seen what we can do when we stop holding back. Consider this a warning and a promise. We are coming for every military installation in your empire until you answer for New Seattle. The message was broadcast continuously as the Terran Defense Fleet departed Krill. Henderson left the Vakrian survivors with functional communications and enough supplies to survive. He wanted them to spread the word about what they had witnessed. He wanted every Vakrian military officer to know that humanity was no longer the restrained, cautious species they had grown accustomed to pushing around. The rules had changed, and the Vakrians had no one to blame but themselves. The fleet moved deeper into Vakrian space with systematic precision. Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Nina Ross had identified 43 priority targets across their empire: military shipyards, fleet bases, weapons manufacturing facilities, command centers. Henderson planned to hit them all. His strategy was not invasion or occupation. Humanity had no interest in controlling Vakrian territory. This was punishment, pure and simple, delivered with overwhelming force. Over the next 2 weeks, the Terran Defense Fleet struck 18 separate targets. Some were defended, some were not. It made no difference to the outcome. Every military installation humanity attacked was either destroyed or captured. Every Vakrian fleet that engaged was annihilated. The human forces moved with speed that Vakrian commanders couldn't match, hitting targets across multiple systems almost simultaneously. The Vakrians couldn't predict where humanity would strike next, and they couldn't mount an effective defense even when they knew attacks were coming. Captain Lisa Morgan coordinated fleet movements from the Defiance's command center. She had access to real-time intelligence from the secret sensor network humanity had been building for decades. She knew where every Vakrian ship was, what condition it was in, and how quickly it could respond to threats. She used that information to keep the human fleet 3 steps ahead of their enemy. When Vakrians reinforced one system, Morgan hit another. When they tried to concentrate their remaining forces, she split the human fleet and attacked from multiple directions. Commander Paul Stevens kept the human ships running at peak efficiency, despite the constant combat operations. Crews worked around the clock, repairing damage, rearming weapons, and maintaining the systems that gave humanity its overwhelming advantage. Stevens had trained his engineering teams for exactly this kind of sustained operation, and they performed flawlessly. The Terran Defense Fleet maintained operational tempo that would have been impossible under Council restrictions. Lieutenant Nina Ross intercepted increasingly desperate communications from the Vakrian High Command. They were sending emergency requests to the Galactic Council, begging for intervention and protection. They claimed humanity was committing acts of illegal aggression and demanded Council forces be deployed to stop the attacks. Nina forwarded these messages to Admiral Henderson, who found them grimly amusing. The Vakrians were screaming for the Council to enforce rules they themselves had violated when they massacred New Seattle. The Galactic Council did issue warnings to Earth, threatening sanctions and military intervention if the attacks continued. Ambassador Victoria Brennan forwarded those warnings to Admiral Henderson, as she was required to do. Henderson sent a single-word response that Victoria then relayed to the Council. No. That one word caused another round of outrage and threats from the Council chambers. Victoria watched the chaos with something approaching satisfaction. For 70 years, humanity had played by their rules. Now the galaxy was learning what happened when those rules failed to protect human lives. By the end of the second week, the Vakrian Empire had lost 40% of its military infrastructure. Their fleet was reduced to scattered remnants, hiding in remote systems. Their production facilities were smoking ruins. Their command structure was in complete disarray. The empire that had so arrogantly attacked New Seattle was broken, and the Terran Defense Fleet showed no signs of stopping. Henderson kept his ships moving, kept the pressure constant, and refused every attempt at negotiation. The Vakrians would answer for their crimes, and humanity would accept nothing less than complete accountability. The Galactic Council convened in emergency session for the third time in as many weeks. The chamber was packed with representatives from every member species, all of them talking over each other in a dozen different languages. Ambassador Victoria Brennan sat in the human delegation area and watched the chaos with calm detachment. She had been summoned to explain humanity's illegal military actions against the Vakrian Empire. She was prepared to do exactly that, though probably not in the way the Council expected. The Council chair, a being from the Elthari species, called for order and demanded that Victoria address the assembly. She stood and walked to the central podium, carrying a data chip that contained information the Council had been trying very hard to ignore. Victoria began by thanking the Council for their concern about humanity's military operations. Then she loaded the data chip, and every screen in the chamber displayed footage from New Seattle. The Council representatives watched Amy Rodriguez coordinate evacuations while her city burned. They watched Vakrian soldiers execute civilians pulled from shelters. They watched children shot in the streets and hospitals burning with patients inside. Victoria let the footage play for 10 full minutes before she paused it and asked a simple question. Where was the Council when this was happening? Where was the emergency session when 22,000 human civilians were being massacred? The Vakrian representative tried to interrupt, but Victoria cut him off. She explained that humanity had followed proper channels after the Meridian Star was destroyed. Earth had filed complaints, provided evidence, and waited for Council justice. The response had been a 90-day investigation timeline, while the Vakrians prepared their next attack. The Council's system had failed to protect human lives, and now they wanted to condemn humanity for protecting themselves. Victoria told them that Earth rejected their condemnation and their authority in this matter. The Council chair threatened sanctions and military intervention. Victoria was ready for that response. She informed the Council that Admiral Kyle Henderson's fleet represented only half of humanity's actual military capability. The other half, 60 warships that the Council had no knowledge of, were currently positioned throughout the sector in defensive formations. If the Council wanted to test humanity's resolve with military force, they were welcome to try. Victoria did not recommend it. Several Council species erupted in outrage at the revelation that humanity had been secretly building warships in violation of Council regulations. Victoria pointed out that those regulations had been imposed without humanity's full consent and had proven inadequate for human security needs. Earth had complied publicly while maintaining necessary defenses privately. Now that the inadequacy of Council protection had been demonstrated so brutally, humanity saw no reason to continue the pretense. The Elthari chair demanded to know humanity's intentions. Would Earth withdraw from the Council? Would they continue their attacks on the Vakrians? What did humanity want? R2 FS. Victoria smiled and told them exactly what humanity wanted. Recognition as a fully sovereign power, independent of Council military oversight, removal of all artificial restrictions on human warship capabilities, the right to defend human territory and citizens without requiring Council approval, and justice for New Seattle. The Council argued for hours, but the reality of the situation was clear. Humanity had demonstrated military capabilities that surprised everyone, including some of Earth's nominal allies. The Terran Defense Fleet had dismantled a significant portion of the Vakrian Empire in 2 weeks with minimal casualties. If the Council tried to intervene militarily, they would be engaging an opponent who had spent decades preparing for exactly that scenario. Several Council species did the math and decided sanctions were preferable to warfare. While the Council debated, Admiral Henderson continued operations in Vakrian space. The pace of attacks had slowed but not stopped. He was being selective now, targeting facilities that had direct connections to the New Seattle operation. Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Nina Ross had identified the specific Vakrian units involved in the massacre, and Henderson was systematically eliminating their bases, their supply lines, and their command structures. He wanted everyone who had participated in the attack to understand there would be consequences. The Vakrian High Command finally sent a direct communication to the UNS Defiance. They requested an immediate ceasefire and offered to negotiate terms. Henderson agreed to halt offensive operations on the condition that negotiations would be conducted on his terms and his timetable. The Vakrians had no choice but to accept. Their empire was crumbling, and the Council was proving unable or unwilling to stop the human fleet. Henderson set the negotiation location as orbit around New Seattle. He wanted the Vakrians to see what they had done. When the Vakrian delegation arrived aboard a diplomatic vessel, they were escorted to a conference room with windows overlooking the ruined colony. Henderson sat across from them with Captain Lisa Morgan and Colonel Sam Turner flanking him. He did not offer pleasantries or diplomatic courtesies. He told them exactly what humanity expected: complete demilitarization of all Vakrian border regions adjacent to human space, full reparations to the survivors of New Seattle, including funding for reconstruction, extradition of every Vakrian officer and soldier who participated in the massacre to face trial under human law, public acknowledgement of guilt, and formal apology to humanity. These terms were not negotiable. The Vakrians would accept them in full, or Henderson would resume operations until the Vakrian Empire ceased to exist. The Vakrian delegates tried to argue that some terms were too harsh, that their government would never accept such humiliation. Henderson stood and walked to the window, gesturing at the ruins below. He asked them if they found these terms more humiliating than what they had done to Amy Rodriguez and Danny Wright and 22,000 civilians who had never threatened anyone. The Vakrians had no answer. They accepted Henderson's terms and signed the documents before leaving as quickly as protocol allowed. News of the Vakrian surrender spread through the Galactic Council like a shockwave. Several species who had been calling for action against humanity suddenly became very quiet. Others, who had long chafed under Council restrictions themselves, began asking questions about the rules everyone operated under. If humanity could build a secret fleet and deploy it successfully, what did that say about the Council's authority? The political ramifications would take years to fully manifest, but the immediate result was clear. No one wanted to be the next species that found out what humanity became when pushed too far. Ambassador Victoria Brennan negotiated humanity's new status with a council that had lost much of its leverage. Earth would remain a council member, but human military forces would operate under their own command structure. All restrictions on human warship capabilities were removed. Humanity would participate in council debates and trade agreements, but would not be bound by decisions they disagreed with. It was not the equal partnership Victoria had originally wanted, but it was something arguably better. Respect earned through strength, rather than granted through diplomacy. The hidden fleet that Victoria had revealed during the council session began making public appearances. 60 warships that represented the cutting edge of human military technology took up defensive positions around Earth and the major colonies. The galaxy saw them and understood that humanity had been holding back for 70 years. The species that had seemed content to follow. Council rules had actually been preparing for the day those rules would fail them. It was a lesson multiple species would study for decades to come. Admiral Henderson returned to New Seattle 3 months after the Vakrian surrender. The colony was being rebuilt with Vakrian reparation funds and support from across human space. Jacob Hayes, the militia commander who had survived the massacre, was now serving as interim governor until proper elections could be held. The population had grown to 12,000 as survivors returned and new settlers arrived, determined to prove that the Vakrians had not succeeded in destroying humanity's presence on this world. A memorial had been constructed in the center of the rebuilt capital. A wall of black stone bore the names of all 22,000 victims. At the top were Governor Amy Rodriguez and Officer Danny Wright, the leaders who had stayed at their posts to the very end. Henderson stood before the wall and placed flowers at its base. He was joined by Captain Morgan, Commander Palmer, Lieutenant Carter, Colonel Turner, and dozens of other officers who had participated in the campaign against the Vakrians. Jacob Hayes gave a short speech thanking the Terran Defense Fleet for delivering justice. He spoke about the people whose names covered the wall, their dreams and hopes, and the lives they had been building before the Vakrians took it all away. He spoke about Amy Rodriguez's determination to document the truth and Danny Wright's courage in staying with his people. He said that New Seattle would never forget what had happened here, and would never forget the fleet that had made the Vakrians answer for their crimes. Henderson responded briefly, saying that he wished none of it had been necessary. He wished the council system had worked, and the Vakrians had never attacked, and 22,000 people were still alive. But wishes meant nothing in a galaxy where species like the Vakrians operated. What mattered was strength, the capability to defend your own, and the will to use that capability when necessary. Humanity had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but they had learned it thoroughly. That evening, Henderson stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance and looked at the stars. She asked him if he regretted the decision to defy the Council and activate Protocol Reckoning. Henderson considered the question carefully before answering. He told her he regretted waiting so long. Humanity had spent 70 years proving they could be peaceful, diplomatic, and restrained. They had followed every rule and respected every regulation. In the end, none of that had protected their people. Morgan understood what he meant. Humanity was not inherently peaceful. They were inherently capable. There was a profound difference between choosing peace and being forced into submission. For 7 decades, humanity had chosen peace while building the capability to defend themselves when peace failed. The galaxy had mistaken capability held in reserve for weakness. The Vakrians had learned the truth too late. The Terran Defense Fleet remained on high alert in the months that followed. The restrictions that had limited them for so long were gone, and every crew member understood their ship's true potential now. They trained with weapons systems that had been dormant for years. They practiced maneuvers that would have violated Council regulations. They prepared for the possibility that other species might see humanity's treatment of the Vakrians as a challenge rather than a warning. But most species saw it exactly as Henderson intended. Humanity was not interested in conquest or expansion. They had not occupied Vakrian territory or demanded tribute. They had simply demonstrated what happened when you attacked human civilians. It was a lesson the galaxy would not forget. Several species that had been considering aggressive actions against human interests quietly reconsidered their plans. Others that had viewed humanity as potential victims revised their assessments entirely. The Council itself was forced to reevaluate how it operated. Humanity had exposed the fundamental weakness in their system. Rules only mattered if everyone followed them, and enforcement only worked if you could actually enforce. The Vakrians had ignored the rules, and the Council had been powerless to deliver justice in any meaningful time frame. Humanity had delivered that justice themselves, and now stood outside the Council's ability to control. It was a precedent that worried many, but inspired others. Ambassador Victoria Brennan settled into her new role as representative of an independent power rather than a subordinate member. She found that other species treated her differently now, with more respect and more caution. Some resented humanity's new status while others admired it. Victoria worked with both groups, building relationships and alliances based on mutual interest rather than council mandates. It was more complex than her previous work but also more honest. On New Seattle, life slowly returned to something approaching normal. The memorial wall became a place where survivors gathered to remember, and newcomers came to understand what this colony had endured. Jacob Hayes won the election for governor and spent his first term focused on security and growth. He made sure every civilian knew basic self-defense, and every settlement had proper shelters and defenses. New Seattle would never be caught unprepared again. The Vacrian Empire struggled to rebuild under the weight of reparations and military restrictions. Their government changed 3 times in the first year after the war, as different factions blamed each other for the disaster. They remained a council member, but their influence was greatly diminished. Most importantly, they maintained meticulous compliance with every term of the treaty Henderson had imposed. No one in the Vacrian government wanted to find out what would happen if they broke that agreement. Admiral Henderson remained in command of the Terran Defense Fleet for another 8 years before retiring. He spent those years ensuring that humanity never returned to the restricted, constrained posture that had made New Seattle possible. He trained the next generation of officers to understand that humanity's strength came not from aggression but from capability and the will to use it. The fleet he left behind was ready for any threat and determined to never let human civilians pay the price for diplomatic failures again. The story of New Seattle and the war that followed became part of human history, taught to every child and studied by every military officer. It was a reminder of what humanity had been forced to become and a warning about the cost of weakness. But it was also a testament to the people like Amy Rodriguez and Danny Wright, who had stood their ground, and to the soldiers like Kyle Henderson and Lisa Morgan, who had delivered justice when no one else would. In the end, the galaxy learned a simple truth about humanity. They were patient and they preferred peace, but they were not harmless. They were not weak simply because they chose restraint, and when you crossed the line, when you attacked their civilians and murdered their children, humanity would stop holding back and show you exactly what they were capable of. The Vacrians learned that lesson, the Council learned it, and the galaxy would never forget.